China's hydroelectric power is greater than the total energy budget of Germany, just to put numbers to it. And so, there are no risk-free endeavors in life. There are no solutions, only trade-offs. And when you balance all of the trade-offs of nuclear versus all of the other primary energy sources, it's by far and away the best choice. Now, can you zero in on one particular risk and demand zero? Sure, but zero is an emotional number and impossible to achieve. And so I would think even in Germany, the coalition is looking pretty shaky. The government's on the verge of collapse, and support for a nuclear resurgence is growing in the politics of Germany. We wouldn't be surprised if the last domino to fall is in fact reversed in Germany in the next year.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Capital Cosm. Today, I have a special returning guest on the show, a guest that you guys have really enjoyed over the course of the last year or so that I've had this podcast. It is none other than Doomberg, the green chicken. Doomberg, thanks for coming on. Thanks for coming back on, I should say.
I was going to say third time's a charm.
Yeah, exactly. Well, neither Doomberg nor I, quick disclaimer, are financial advisors. So please do your own due diligence. It's your money, your responsibility. Doomberg, I don't think the audience really needs an intro. We've had two other shows before. If you haven't seen those shows, maybe you should go back and watch them. They're all in the archives. With that said, Doomberg, 2023 was a wild ride. 2024 looks to be even wilder. What's your outlook for 2024?
So our outlook for 2024 begins with an assessment of the geopolitical situation. We have two live kinetic conflicts in very sensitive parts of the world. Of course, we have the war in Ukraine, which doesn't seem to be going so well for the West. Not that you would find much of that in regular press. And then there's the outbreak of hostilities in the Middle East. And both of those are significant risks to the global economy. We're seeing that now play out, for example, in the Red Sea and the blocking of the shipping lanes, and whether or not that might catalyze an escalation of the war to a direct conflict between the US and Iran remains to be seen. So that's the big geopolitical risk heading into 2024. On the energy side, geopolitics notwithstanding, all things being equal, we are beginning to see the beginning of a bit of a glut in the fossil fuel sector. We put a piece out recently called Liquefied Natural Glut, which walked through our thinking on that front. And then tomorrow, or a day after you and I record this podcast, we're going to be publishing a piece titled Peak Cheap Oil is a Myth, where we specifically address the booming production of natural gas liquids in shale patch and what that means for the global energy complex. And our view is that we're, anytime you have a huge run up in prices like we did in 21 and 22, inevitably industry responds, and we're beginning to see the beginning signs of that response manifesting in the market. The natural gas liquids is just really an amazing story that is so undertold because it's not called oil. It's not, considered part of the oil complex. And so we're making the point in this piece that we should redefine oil as, quote, any hydrocarbon that finds its way into a refinery. And once you look at the oil markets through that lens, things really open up. So those are the two big things we're looking at, sort of geopolitical risk, which of course could drive energy prices skyrocketing overnight if the wrong things happen. But all things being equal, if we smooth our way through without any further escalation, then I would say that we're facing some pretty formidable headwinds in the energy sector. And those are the two things that are top of mind for us.
Yeah. So in the absence of no geopolitical risk, and what was the other point you mentioned?
The growing glut in
the growing glut.
Yeah.
We're not anticipating any wild swings in 2024. Is that an accurate assessment?
Well, I would say if the geopolitics explodes, then you will see all manner of wild swings.
Barring those two.
I would say we'll see significant headwinds for the energy complex. We're seeing that already. Of course, natural gas is well off its highs in Europe, and coal has followed. Coal has followed accordingly, and oil is struggling to stay in the 70s despite these geopolitical tensions in the Middle East, which have surprised to many. And so, why is that? And that was part of the reason why we've been researching these pieces and putting them out. We started Doomberg when energy was exploding higher, but you have to read the markets as the cards are laid on the table. And I think if you read liquefied natural glut and then read the next piece we're putting out together, you'll see our reasoning for the basis of some potential headwinds there for the energy complex.
Yeah. And what about oil? Oil sitting at 73. It's kind of leveled off. What do you think about oil?
Yeah. So in general, the fossil fuels tend to trade in unison or pretty highly correlated because there is a fair degree of switchability amongst them. So oil is still burned to produce electricity in many parts of the world, for example, and you can do that with natural gas instead. There's direct switchability. There's indirect switchability. For example, the chemical industry runs what are known as flexi crackers, and they could either run on natural gas liquids or naphtha, which is a product of oil, and natural gas liquids is mostly associated with shale oil and or natural gas associated gas. And so there's a lot of blurring of the lines, and anything that is bearish for natural gas and coal is inevitably, all things being equal, bearish for oil as well.
Yeah. Now, the Fed has signaled that they're looking for a pause in their rate hiking cycle. They even signaled some rate cuts down the line in 2024. Would rate cuts impact the fossil fuel demand at all?
Well, it couldn't hurt, in to the extent that bullish stock market tends to trickle down into tax receipts and overall economic activity, capital gains, and so on. And so, sure, the Fed action on the one hand is marginally beneficial to the demand for oil, but it is also beneficial to the supply of oil as capital becomes cheaper to acquire. And a discipline which seems to be lacking in the shale patch continues, unrealized. And so this puts and takes, I'd say, on balance, if you pushed us, a booming stock market. There's this great mystery on FinTwit and some of the sort of analysis that we read as to why it is that the U.S. has avoided a recession so far. And we think the answer is perhaps a little too straightforward, but the U.S. has access to the vastest sum of the world's cheapest hydrocarbons. That is a huge economic competitive advantage. Natural gas in the U.S. today is trading at an energy equivalent price of $13 a barrel oil, and we're choking on it. We can't get rid of it fast enough. The amount of natural gas coming out of the Permian alone is swamping the rate at which we're building LNG export capacity. We went from nothing in the LNG export market as late as 2015 to the world's largest exporter of the stuff less than a decade later. It's a true miracle. In fact, as we quote in our piece, our friend Rory Johnston at the Commodity Complex pointed out that if you just measured U.S. natural gas liquids production, it would be the second largest member of OPEC. The U.S. is an energy giant. It has the most advantaged feedstocks in the world. It's bigger and way more relevant and way more efficient than Saudi Arabia. And we're sitting on this mountain of economic advantage. It's not surprising to us necessarily that the U.S. economy has not yet slipped into a recession. Now, it doesn't mean that it won't, but I can tell you that dirt cheap, radically abundant hydrocarbons is an incredible driver of profitability for a manufacturing sector undergoing a wave of onshoring. And so I think the stars have aligned for the U.S. economy, and they're doing quite well. I mean, if you add natural gas liquids and oil production, we're over 20 million barrels a day. It's incredible, really.
Yeah. So, I mean, the U.S. is swimming in a sea of energy. So it kind of boggles the mind. Why do a lot of these United States-based policymakers and industry leaders, why are they championing this green energy movement, especially which would come at the cost of U.S. supremacy?
Yeah, it's amazing. Imagine what we would be if we got out of our own way. I mean, when you think about it, I mean, look, we have pointed this out in our articles and during our Doom Zoom for our Pro tier, which we do once a month. If you look at what the Biden administration is actually doing versus what it's saying, it's running a pretty reasonable energy policy, all things being considered. He has to handle the radical progressive environmental left, which is a very loud, but in reality, quite small portion of his political team. And in fact, I would argue that the UAW is way more powerful. the environmentalists, and they're significantly opposed to electric vehicles, for example, because they view them as job killers. And so, if you look at what Biden says, he sounds like he's running a very progressive environmental extremist policy. But if you look at what he's doing, the U.S. is the largest producer of natural gas by a wide margin. The U.S. is the largest producer of oil by a wide margin. The Mountain Valley Pipeline is getting complete. There's a new pipeline approved to connect Alberta to Pacific Northwest. California and New England are still kind of energy vassals and running crazy policies, but by and large, President Biden, we used to joke when I was in industry that he was the president, D, DuPont. He wasn't actually from Delaware. He was the senator from DuPont. He understands the importance of the commodity industry, and he understands the critical role the price of gasoline plays in his political future, which is why, of course, he drained the Strategic Petroleum Reserve heading into the midterm elections and successfully put a cap on the price of oil, brought gasoline prices down, and we would argue is one of the reasons why the Democrats outperformed expectations in the midterms. And so, he's an old school politician. He's obviously a very polarizing figure. All presidents are. But if you look at it objectively, sure, we will still tinker around with wind and solar and electric vehicles, and we'll pretend like they will be a meaningful contributor to our energy future. But we just recorded our December Doom Zoom for approach here, which is we called Coulda, Woulda, Shoulda, Doomberg's readout from COP28. In reality, we think COP28 is peak ESG. The presence of the fossil fuel industry and big ag at this meeting in huge numbers means the adults have taken back control of the steering wheel. We'll allow the children to play with wind and solar, but the adults are back in charge. And there were some meaningful things that happened at COP28, but by and large, business as usual.
Yeah. I want to tinker with your point there on the SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, for a second there. I'm going to get a lot of flack for this, but draining the SPR during the midterms to put a cap on the oil price to in the mid 70s. I mean, what other reason do we have an SPR to begin with, if not to sustain prices for the consumer? Like, isn't that the entire purpose of the SPR to begin with?
Well, not quite. But I'm sympathetic to where you're headed, which wasn't as big a deal as it was perhaps made out to be from a national security perspective. The SPR was originally built when the U.S. was deeply short energy in the aftermath of the embargo in the 70s. And its specific intent was to ensure supply for the economy, to be sure, but most importantly, ready access to supply for the U.S. military in case of a conflict. And to the extent that we have drained half of it in the name of controlling prices at the pump, that could be viewed as reckless, and we certainly wrote as much when it was happening. On the flip side, we're no longer short energy. We are net exporters of both oil and finished products. Our refiners aren't quite optimized for the grades of crude we're producing in abundance, and so we export a lot of crude and we import a lot of heavier grades. We do a lot of blending with NGLs, and we actually have more refining capacity than we need domestically. And so, from a national security perspective, the SPR has lost some significance in the equation. We are, of course, of the prepper mindset and would view it to be prudent to have maintained those levels of the SPR. Having said that, there was a war that broke out between Ukraine and Russia, which is a proxy war between the US and Russia. Let's not kid ourselves. And Russia is a major exporter of commodities, including natural gas and oil. And the price of oil did skyrocket to $135 a barrel at its peak. And the price of natural gas in Europe exploded to $100 per million BTU intraday at the peak. And that's the equivalent of $600 a barrel oil for those keeping score at home. And so there was a genuine international emergency that was affecting the price of commodities. Now, we have argued and continue to argue that our foolhardy sanctions policy only made it worse. And if we had been smarter about our sanctions policy, we would not have to have drained the SPR to the extent that we did. But it's done. The deal is done, as we would say. They're slowly starting to refill it, although we suspect they never quite will. And such is life. But the one thing that the release of the SPR proves to people, which is a point we make constantly, is the extreme inelasticity of demand. 1% of global oil was released every day. And that was enough to cut the price of oil in half, which tells you the dangers of the geopolitics that we opened this discussion with, that if, you know, war really does break out in the Middle East beyond, the Palestinians and the Israelis, then you could see the price of oil right back up to $150 or $200 or higher rather quickly. Predicted gluts by Team Doomberg notwithstanding.
Yeah, so it's a very fragile system.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, it's very inelastic.
Yeah.
Which is, again, if we had a bigger SPR buffer, we would be in a position to handle that a little bit better. So we'll see. The market is clearly not signaling a wider confrontation, by the way, because I believe we'd be in the 90s if we're stuck here in the 70s. And so even with the disruptions in the Red Sea, which you would have thought would have added $10 to $15 the barrel price of oil, it really hasn't. It went up a few bucks. We were below 70 last week, as I recall. But we'll see. Keep an eye on the Middle East for sure, and keep an eye on Ukraine. Look, Putin has the upper hand, and I think we just need to acknowledge that. And we've made some serious mistakes. We are, of course, pro peace, and we think the U.S. could and should do a lot more to prevent involving itself in such confrontations abroad. But nonetheless, here we are.
Yeah. I like the fact you brought up the market, not really anticipating any further escalation, at least in the near term. Because you look at the price of oil, it's still at 73, gold still around the same level it was when the war started in Gaza and Israel, and but isn't this rise in gold from 2000 to 2150 and then back down? Isn't that kind of indicative of more inflation ahead? Because gold kind of sniffs out inflation ahead of time. If you rewind back to 2020, gold had its big rise up, hit new all-time highs, and then it was only a year later that we saw the inflation that we did. Do you think that has any indication, given the gold market's move?
We would be more in the Luke Roman camp on this question. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work on the matter, but I'm happy to summarize it for your viewers. The big change in the gold market is the opening up of the Shanghai gold window, which allows the bluff to be called on the so-called paper manipulation of gold in London and in New York. And anytime we see a large spread open up, it gets closed rather quickly as people redeem physical in London and deliver it to China and close the gap. And so one of the things that we are watching very closely is the spread between Shanghai gold and London, which you pull up on your Bloomberg terminal with a bit of effort. Because now we believe, because of the sanctions policy against Russia and the freezing of the Russian reserve assets, gold is beginning to displace ever so slightly treasuries as the neutral reserve asset of international trade. And if that accelerates, the price of gold could really go much higher from here, as priced in US dollars. And in fact, oil could, the US dollar could continue to be debased against oil, but that doesn't necessarily mean oil is becoming more expensive, except for Americans, of course. But what it could mean is that we're just seeing the debasement of the dollar as people move away from it in international trade, ever so slowly. Look, the dollar is not going to collapse, and the U.S. reserve currency will still be the dollar. But as far as reserve asset, which is a different thing, we're seeing more and more central banks accumulate gold. And now we have this arbitrage window in China, which, broadly speaking, given how efficient the gold markets are, causes an upward pressure on the price of gold, in our view. And if, in fact, the grand sort of, I hate the word, but the grand conspiracy theory of paper market manipulation, if true, and I happen to be sympathetic to that view, if that unwinds, we could see fireworks. So I wouldn't say that this rise in gold is necessarily signaling inflation, although it does signal trouble ahead for the dollar potentially. So we're very bullish gold. We're long gold in our portfolios. It's one of the ways that we save. I have a substantial holding in the Sprott Physical Uranium, the Sprott Physical Gold Trust, and so we should disclose that, but not like anything you and I say is going to affect the price of gold. But still, it's good for listeners to know that I have skin in the game here personally.
Yeah, totally. You mentioned uranium, and you also mentioned COP28 earlier in the conversation. I kind of want to take it there. As I alluded to before we hit record on this interview, I met with Chris Kiefer earlier this week, and he was at COP28. alive and in living color. And he basically told me, just like you were just telling me, is that there was a huge discernible sea change in the sentiment and demeanor of people's attitude towards nuclear. So much so that they have this big target to increase nuclear adoption by 3x by 2050. So that's a target that he thinks is a little bit aggressive. A big nuclear advocate like Chris sees that as a highly aggressive move. So do you think that, how much weight do you put behind these COP28 targets, and what do you make of that the sea change in sentiment with nuclear?
Got me in a good time because we literally just laid down a track for the December Doom Zoom where we did a sector by sector analysis of what was agreed upon, who are the winners and losers, and what is the likelihood of implementation for all of the major energy verticals. And nuclear, in our view, was the big winner of COP28. As you mentioned, the U.S., frankly, credit to the Biden administration, building on comments that we made earlier, the U.S. led that coalition of 22 nations that committed to triple their collective nuclear power capacity by 2050. I think it's quite doable, not without its challenges, but we've moved mountains for less benefit before. And so we do think nuclear was the big winner. Additionally, for the first time, nuclear was referred to as quote unquote clean in the global stock take, which is sort of the official readout from COP28. And we have argued, and did so in this presentation, that the Malthusian opposition to nuclear power is steadily becoming more and more untenable. And so in our view, the winners and losers are pretty apparent. The winners are humanity, first and foremost. We're big believers in nuclear power. The nuclear power sector are also winners. Uranium miners, another set of winners, and the pro-nuclear activists like Chris, the others on Twitter, and we've played a small role in that as well. I think that we have been largely and vastly outspent by the Malthusian environmental left, and yet I would argue that the small but very nimble and powerful pro-nuclear activist movement on various social media platforms has been disproportionately effective. Biggest losers are old school Malthusians, of course, and unfortunately Western coal power plant owners, because their days are numbered. That's part of the grand bargain that we believe came out of COP28 that we could possibly talk about. And then to close the loop on nuclear, we would put the likelihood of implementation as quite high. It builds on a pre-existing and very strong global momentum. It requires no real technical inventions, just some financing and insurance, which government is particularly good at providing. So our view is consistent with your punch, which is that nuclear is a big, big winner of COP28.
What do you think of the idea? This is just an idea out there that I've heard. I didn't make this up, but I've heard that the reason why a country like Germany might be less willing to, or willing to let go of their nuclear power plants and nuclear adoption is because they see these nuclear plants as military targets from for an adversarial enemy to strike. Do you see any credibility to that argument?
I think it's mostly nonsense. Let me give you a counter. What are all of the hundreds and hundreds of dams that scatter the Chinese landscape, if not devastating targets of war? How about Quebec and all of the hydropower facilities there, which basically is the lifeblood for New York and much of New England? A few targeted strikes at dams would cause massive and far more destructive damage to the local environment than trying to blow up a nuclear power plant would. And the consequences would be just as large for the lack of power. And yet we're building or have built thousands of hydroelectric power facilities. In fact, one collapsed in China. We wrote about this piece several months ago, where something like 250,000 people were killed. Compare that to the safety track record of the civilian nuclear energy sector. Nobody is calling for the closure of these hydroelectric dams. Chinese hydroelectricity is 2% of all global primary energy consumption. It's really staggering. China's hydroelectric power is greater than the total energy budget of Germany, just to put numbers to it. And so, there are no risk-free endeavors in life. There are no solutions, only trade-offs. And when you balance all of the trade-offs of nuclear versus all of the other primary energy sources, it's by far and away the best choice. Now, can you zero in on one particular risk and demand zero? Sure, but zero is an emotional number and impossible to achieve. And so I would think even in Germany, the coalition is looking pretty shaky. The government's on the verge of collapse, and support for a nuclear resurgence is growing in the politics of Germany. We wouldn't be surprised if the last domino to fall is in fact in reverse Germany in the next year or two.
Yeah, yeah. So, it seems like you kind of pointed this out too, that the Malthusians are losing. They've given up on their opposition to nuclear. You have all the stuff that the Biden administration has been doing within our borders to increase our energy capacity. So, was this always going to happen? Was all this just a pipe dream, or do you think that these Malthusian ideologies it doesn't come from a place of ignorance, it comes from a place of destructiveness?
I would make a minor correction to what you said. They haven't given up; they've just been defeated.
They've been what?
They've just been defeated.
Defeated. Okay.
Yeah, there's a difference. They're not giving up. They will go out quite loudly.
Right.
Just follow Al Gore's Twitter account if you're interested to see.
Oh yeah, did you see his tirade?
I did
the other week.
Absolutely, of course. This is why I bring it up. But no, I would say that the Malthusian movement was always born out of an ugly history of eugenics. Their not so secret ambition is that there should be far fewer people on the planet. They don't believe that the planet is capable of supporting the number of people we have today, let alone continuing to grow our population into the future, to which we have always said, you first. Nobody's stopping you from an early departure. And it's very quickly begs the question of who gets to say and who doesn't, and how does one choose? We have our own guesses as to how the Malthusians go about choosing based on their ugly history. But nonetheless, this is just a losing proposition. So there's only so long you could fake and hide what your true intentions are as the real consequences of your foolhardy policies become obvious to the population. And so we have long said that on the path from abundance to starvation is riot. And the time from empty grocery stores to the guillotining of politicians is quite short. If people won't put up with it, they will riot first with their votes and then with physical violence. If it comes to that, people will protect themselves and their family if they are robbed of the ability to develop prosperity for themselves and their loved ones. And this is something we've been warning about. Like, you're poking the bear, and the bear will roar back. And we're seeing the bear roar back. And we've been warning about this, not hoping it happens, hoping to avoid it, but we're seeing a very right-wing tilt in European politics, and populist reactionaries are ascending to power in the Western world. And we view this as a trend that will continue until we get our energy policy right. And this is, in fact, why I've been relatively impressed by what the U.S. has been able to do, despite the political polarity in our country. We are sitting on a gold mine. We thought about writing a piece about all the advantages that the U.S. still has, have not yet thought about whether we'll do that. We have a global audience, and we don't want to sound too, Peter Zeihan in our analysis, but the U.S. has done its energy policy well. I would argue the only country that has done energy better than the U.S. is Norway, believe it or not, and they're not in the European Union. Norway, and they're not in the European Union, so they've done quite well for themselves as well.
Yeah. I mean, the reason why I asked that question is because you can track this movement all the way back down to Malthus himself. They've been making projections on population growth and how unsustainable life on the planet would be given a certain population growth. And we keep knocking out those projections and nothing ever happens. You trace this all back to the Galton Institute. And I've even read papers from the Club of Rome where they said, we must use the planet as a reason to implement, this kind of agenda. So, and you look at acid rain, the acid rain thing in the 80s, the ozone layer in the 90s, then they switch over to global warming and then climate change, et cetera. It really kind of begs the question, how much of this is actually just ignorance and how much of it is actually, part of, some, I don't want to say agenda, but it's a long-standing ideology that goes back that, humans have it way too good. And, we need to be able to rein in measures to be able to turn the switches and the levers to our liking.
Yeah, I would say that of the examples you used, the ozone layer was a real problem caused by unnatural fluorochemicals that the countries got together and solved. We would put that in the pollution category, not the climate category. And I would say that the Montreal Protocol, I believe it's called, and all of the actions to reduce fluorocarbons from the atmosphere were wise and well implemented. But the rest of the examples you use, we would approach with the same level of skepticism as you do. And it's just undeniable that the Malthusian origin of the modern progressive environmental movement is laid bare. We wrote a piece called Malthusian Malarkey, where we highlighted some of the ugly propaganda that was used in the 50s and 60s. Let's just say it didn't age well. They're embarrassed by it. They're trying to cover it up, and they're trying to memory hole it, but it's there. You could go and look in the New York Times archives for the stuff that we quoted. I won't repeat it here because it is pretty ugly, and I don't want to demonetize your podcast. But there's no question that was certainly the motivation for the founding members. Now, whether the average environmentally concerned citizen has such Malthusian ambitions, I would argue that they mostly don't. They are probably just unaware of the consequences of actually carrying out the policies that they're advocating for. I think many people have been fooled into believing these things that the core leaders have been putting out. For example, the opposition to nuclear power is just utterly unexcusable, indefensible from a science perspective, from a humanitarian perspective. They oppose nuclear power precisely because it gives abundant carbon-free energy to the unwashed masses. And this is why they're opposed to it. And this is why they have popped up nuclear wastes all beyond all possible, scientific likelihood as being a problem. You can't find a single human being on the planet who's ever been injured by nuclear waste. Not one. And 250,000 people died with one dam collapse in China because of a freak weather event. Like those two things have to be weighed against each other. And so they're losing. They're on the back foot. We say peak ESG was probably achieved at COP28. The adults have taken back control of the steering wheel, and we think that's unabashedly a good thing.
Great. So, we've always been talking about how the world should be, et cetera. But how do you think the world will turn out, let's say, in the next 10 years?
Yeah, so one of the things we talked about in our presentation, which is going out today, is what we call the grand bargain on climate change. And we think there are 6 components to that grand bargain. So I'll share those with you now. And you can go in any direction that you would like. But the first thing is coal will be phased out in the West and will be replaced with natural gas or nuclear, much to the chagrin.
And by the way, if you want to share anything, I've just given you sharing.
Oh, no, that's fine. I have it all. Right. I have it all in memory. So I have a good memory for the things we write. The second is that the developing world will continue to burn coal to improve its standard of living. That's just, going to happen. China and India and Indonesia did not sign on to the famous renewable pledge that you and I were discussing earlier. And China is going on an epic build out of coal that swamps any savings that the West will provide. The third leg of this grand bargain is that carbon capture and sequestration will be used to minimize direct CO2 emissions globally. Now, whether China participates in that in a big way remains to be seen. I think the most important thing beyond nuclear power to come out of COP28 is the fourth plank in this grand bargain, which is industry will do its best to minimize methane emissions. Methane is a potent global warming potential gas, and we have a lot of it leak from or vent from natural gas fields around the world, and flaring of natural gas as well will be minimized. Nuclear power, as we discussed, fifth plank of the grand bargain, will be accelerated to further decarbonize electricity grids. And then the last is the West will continue to tinker around with solar and wind and electric vehicles, and we'll make believe like these things will be consequential 10 years from now, when reality, everybody kind of knows and winks and smiles that they won't. Those are the 6 big ones. Coal is done in the West. Coal will continue to be burned in record volumes in the global South. CCS will proliferate. Industry will eliminate methane. Nuclear power is back on the table, and we'll still play around with wind.
What do you think about this anti-meat movement?
Good luck.
Do you think that's going to stick around or no?
I hope they keep trying, because that is probably the biggest political loser on the board for them.
Yeah, I heard you. I mean, you mentioned reduction of methane, so I was wondering if that was tying.
Oh, sure, but no. This is more flaring and venting of natural gas, nuisance natural gas in the field. This will all be buttoned up. Accidents will be minimized, leaks will be detected, surveillance will be stepped up. I think that is actually probably the most consequential thing if you actually think carbon emissions are bad and need to be reined in. The agreement, I think it was 50 of the largest fossil fuel companies in the world came together. In fact, Darren Woods, CEO of Exxon, made his debut at COP28. Exxon had never been to a COP meeting before. I think he went in large part to be part of this methane deal. The industry should have done this long ago. Kudos to them for getting their handle around it now. This is probably 10 to 20% of global emissions that we're talking about, and a real tangible outcome that few could disagree with. We would be all for it. And so really, COP28 and the methane emission agreement and so on, and carbon capture and all of that stuff, you should think of COP28 as a roadmap for how business as usual will be allowed to continue.
Yeah. I mean, you heard the exchange between that UAE minister and that one lady from Ireland,
yes,
like off camera. And then he said the same thing on camera. He basically said, she was trying to chastise him that, oh, you're not doing enough to mitigate the climate change thing. And he says, well, all due respect, we're the producers here. You have no idea what it takes to actually make this stuff. And you have no idea what all of the benefits that it brings you and so forth. And then he went on, said it on camera as well for added measure. So sure. Yeah, so it highlights what you're saying here, that the adults are back in the room, it seems, and there's a line that's been put in the sand, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at John Kerry, the farcical face of the progressive environmental left. I mean, how could he go to this meeting and lecture anybody, given the U.S. and its production of fossil fuels, which has exploded? We've added the equivalent to, I think, 2 Saudi Arabias in the past 20 years. It's really a remarkable thing. And so, this was always had to be. The only question that was really outstanding was how much pain would we have to suffer to get somewhere near where we are today? We went through the global energy crisis of 21 and 22, and that was a fair amount of pain. I think, Germany's deindustrialization continues unabated, and Western Europe in particular is an energy vassal of diminished geopolitical relevance, and will be, frankly, forever thus in the decades ahead, because they just aren't in control of their own energy policy. They're outsourcing it to people that might not like them someday, like they found out with the Russians, and frankly, they might find out with the U.S. I mean, just because they've switched from Russia to U.S. LNG for the reliance on most of their energy, or a big chunk of their energy. Most is probably an exaggeration. Doesn't mean that we'll always have great relations with the Europeans. This is why you should always be producing your own energy if you can. This is why we no longer need the SPR to the extent that we did, because we are energy giants. When I say we, I live in the U.S., of course. And so, yeah, this is the outcome that always had to be. The Malthusians won't go quietly. The protests will escalate. There will be a big move to bar industry from COP29. That's one of our predictions from this presentation. I think that'll all be washed away. One of the more humorous things that shows you the ever-weakening power of the Malthusians is this half-hearted attempt to rebrand natural gas as fossil gas, which is something that we have been noticing in some of the more left-leaning media that we consume. We try to consume everything to see what both sides are saying. There's an ongoing effort, which we predict will fail, to relabel natural gas as fossil gas, and their inability to control the narrative, because really their main power was always propaganda. And I think, thanks to the distributed nature of social media and the ability to extract some of the smartest people in the world on Twitter and on Substack and on YouTube, the grand middle, what we would call the soft left and the soft right, never really signed up for things like giving up meat. And that's what's going to have to happen if we're going to meet these crazy net zero goals by 2050, which we won't. By the way, one of our big conclusions from our assessment of COP28 is the so-called 1.5 degree target will be missed. It will be missed badly.
What is that? 1.5 what?
A 1.5 degree target.
Degree. Okay.
Yeah. This magical 1.5 degrees or the world is going to fall apart. We're going to plow right through that. And we're going to deal with the consequences as they occur, which is something we've always said. Like, nobody is going to give up their lifestyles today for some uncertain bet about potential avoidance of some hardship decades ahead. It's just not going to happen. It's pushing on the ultimate political rope. And so I think, that's the main conclusion from COP28. And we do think this was the peak. I can't imagine, I was looking at some of the numbers, 100,000 attendees and 400,000 people at the periphery. That has to be peak. I mean, none of those people got there by boat. They all flew on jets, some of them private, many of them private, I would assume, burning copious amounts of jet fuel to get there and back. I mean, this is really an incredible waste of energy, ironically, will add to the carbon emissions of 2023 in a huge way. And, so that irony is not lost on the grand middle. They see this hypocrisy, and they've had just about enough of it, being honest.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and these people are naive to human nature. I mean, it's like when you've got economic crisis at your doorstep, the last thing on your mind is what's coming down the pike 30, 40 years from now. It just doesn't click with human psychology.
Yeah, look, all humans everywhere want a better standard of living, and your standard of living is defined by how much energy you get to harvest, period. That's two fundamental truisms, which we have been arguing from the very beginning. We're coming up on 3 years now. I believe it. It's crazy. And this is proven true. And we've often said, it's almost cliche now, that in the war between platitudes and physics is undefeated. And I would say physics was a big winner of COP28.
Right. So are your SIG's projections, so to speak, are they factoring in like global war or things to that effect, or what?
I mean, those are sort of signposts and directions. I mean, the road from here to there will be choppy, and sometimes the bridge will be blown out. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you have to, take a different route or catch a train instead of a car. But we'd like to point to sort of directionally on the multi-year time horizon what we think is the trend, and then you could observe deviations from that trend as potentially tradable opportunities, for example. But by and large, those are our 6 takeaways. Reading between the lines. We almost went to COP28 ourselves. We were invited, but once war broke out in the Middle East, we decided that that was not the way we wanted to go out, and so we declined the invitation. But would have been interesting to go. But from our friends who have gone, and you mentioned your speaker, but we know many other people as well who were there. This is sort of all right, this is what we're going to do, and then we're going to roll the dice on the rest.
Got it. One last question. So for 2024, are we looking at, in your opinion, a recession, more inflation, stagflation? What do you think is the kind of the overall macro prognosis for 2024?
I would be fading calls of recession in the U.S., especially as we head into an election year. I think the Fed and the Biden administration will do whatever they can to juice. Look at what they did for the midterm election. Now square that. Mm-hmm. That's what they're going to do in the presidential election. I think the Washington D.C. establishment is definitely afraid of a resurging Donald Trump, and they will. The real big risk we see is a true breaking of the American political discourse. I think not that we do politics, but you have to observe politics to understand markets sometimes. This barring of Trump from the ballot in Colorado is almost certain to create a Streisand effect and only increases popularity in our view. And so the obsession with keeping Trump out of office will mean that they will do everything they can to spur economic growth, to keep energy prices under wraps, to make gasoline cheap at the pump, to pass whatever stimulus they need, whatever the Fed can do without approval of Congress, the Fed will do. This is, in our view, one of the main reasons why they're signaling potentially rate cuts in 2024, even though we don't think inflation is truly whipped. And so I think viewing the developments in the U.S. economy through that lens is important. You should do your best to try to set aside your partisanship and just look at it from an ideological lens and from a game theory lens. What will these people likely do? And so that's probably the biggest risk on the board is a political breaking in the U.S. Driven by this schism between the two sides over the Donald Trump issue. And I would say, I'd be the first to say that many on the Republican side are just as afraid of a resurging Donald Trump as the Democrats would be. And then we would watch what happens with the wars as well. Those are sort of the big risks on the board.
Yeah, and in true central planning fashion, I mean, these guys haven't, they only see things one step ahead. They don't look at second, third, fourth, nth order effects. And when you remove Donald Trump from the ballot in a place like Colorado, you've got to ask yourself, where are those votes going to go to? In a state that Donald Trump wasn't going to win to begin with, most likely, all those votes are going to go to RFK probably, and then you've also got the RFK vote that's seeping out from the Biden vote. So Biden might actually lose Colorado to RFK in the process.
Yeah, it's just so much can happen between here and
Yeah.
there, and one day we might start a political newsletter under a different masthead. But it is fascinating. We did write a piece talking about the divisions in Congress and how the Democrats might regret playing the small role that they played in getting McCarthy out of the speakership, and we used that as the basis to predict that funding for Ukraine would dry up. And sure enough, here we are, end of the year, no deal on Ukraine funding. Ukraine in a ever decreasing position relative to Putin, and Putin walking around the world cocksure of himself, and demanding big concessions to end the war. And so this is, again, the political challenges in Washington, D.C. are things that no investor or analyst of the markets, energy or stock or even the bond markets can ignore. And so you have to have a view on it. You have to observe it. You have to be as impartial as you can.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've said it before. It's important to understand the politics and geopolitics, especially if you're trying to understand markets, because a lot of these markets are politicized.
100%.
So if you're just looking at this from a very myopic lens, that I'm not going to pay attention to the political side, I mean, you're not getting the full story, and you're doing yourself a disservice as an energy investor or navigator. So
I totally agree.
Yeah, so that's all I got today for you, Doomberg. Where can people find you?
Yeah, all of our work now is at doomberg.substack.com. We have paused our participation on Twitter for a variety of reasons that we laid out in August. And so we are active on the Substack version of Twitter, I guess you could call it, which is Notes. We publish under the masthead 6 to 8 times per month at doomberg.substack.com. If you go to that webpage, you'll see all of our articles, our pro page for our monthly Doom Zooms. We also have a page up there where we post links to all the podcasts we've done. So when this one comes out, we'll post a link to that on our page. And, we are 100% subscriber supported. #1 paid finance Substack in the world, which is amazing and thrilling and humbling and life altering, frankly, for our families. And so it's been an amazing ride, as has been my 3 appearances here with you. Super thrilled to be back, and happy to do it anytime you'll have us back on.
Fantastic. Well, guys, if you enjoyed this content with Doomberg, be sure to give us a like. Also, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and comment down below. Let me know what you think. I'll try to reply to every single comment so you and I can have a little back and forth. Really interested to hear what you guys have to think here with Doomberg. And with that said, you guys, I will see you in the next episode. Bye, y'all.